Welcome to this journey of one of the most distressing cases in documented history in rural Tennessee. Please let me know where you're watching from and when you first heard this story in the comments section before we start. We want to know where these recorded accounts come from and what time of day or night they arrive. In the autumn of 1953, the small farming village of Millfield Hollow, hidden in the shadow of the Cumberland Mountains in eastern Tennessee, became the scene for what investigators would subsequently identify as one of the most psychologically complicated cases in the region's documented history. Up until 1967, when a graduate student studying rural Tennessee genealogy discovered a collection of letters, medical reports, and testimonies that depicted systematic psychological manipulation over nearly 2 decades. The events surrounding the Tinsley family property would remain mostly buried in county records. The Tinsley sisters, Cordelia and Magnolia, were 28 and 26 respectively, when they inherited their family's 100-acre property following the death of their father, Jeremiah Tinsley, in March of 1953. The sisters had spent their entire adult lives on the remote ranch, taking care of their increasingly reclusive father following the death of their mother from illness in 1941, according to county probate records. They were considered by their neighbors as smart but eccentric women who almost ever left their land, save for going to church and getting necessities, on alternating Sundays. The farm itself was at the end of a short dirt road that led to the main county highway after winding through a deep hardwood forest for over 3 kilometers. It felt profoundly isolating. Mrs. Beulah Carmichael, whose own property lay 2 miles distant and represented the nearest neighbor, later stated that she may go weeks without seeing either sister despite living reasonably close by country standards. The Tinsley property had a sizable barn, a main farmhouse constructed in the 1890s, multiple. Over time, as Jeremiah's health deteriorated, fields and structures that had been let to grow wild again. What differentiated the Tinsley sisters from other remote farming families was not their reclusiveness, but rather what county medical records would subsequently show about their peculiar living situation. Dr. Horace Peaton, who served as the area's only physician until his retirement in 1959, made extensive records of his visits to the Tinsley farm. These documents were found. A series of visits from 1945 to 1958 that chronicled progressively odd behavioral observations and contradicting medical histories provided by the sisters was discovered in 1964, when his previous office was being cleared out. According to Dr. Peaton's notes, Cordelia, the elder sister, demonstrated what he described as obsessive protective actions toward Magnolia, regularly responding inquiries directed at the younger woman and insisting on being present throughout all medical examinations. His observations were more concerning Magnolia's apparent deterioration in cognitive ability throughout the years, despite her relatively youthful age and absence of any recognizable neurological illness. His records from 1947 describe her as articulate and responsive, while writings from 1955 define her as childish in speech patterns and requiring constant coaching from her sister for fundamental judgments. 3 months after their father's passing, in June 1953, there was the first recorded sign that anything was seriously off. When Cordelia appeared alone at Dr. Peaton's office asking medication for what she described as Magnolia's spells of bewilderment and violent outbursts, she clarified that since their father's death, her sister had been suffering from extreme anxiety and what seemed to be memory lapses. Dr. Peaton's records reveal that he requested to check Magnolia immediately, but Cordelia maintained that trip was difficult due to her sister's condition and the absence of reliable transportation. Dr. Peaton was especially struck by Cordelia's thorough understanding of medical jargon and her clinically accurate symptom descriptions. In terminology that seemed at odds with her rural upbringing and lack of formal education, she described Magnolia's dissociative periods and heightened emotional capacity. When asked about this information, Cordelia clarified that she had been reading medical texts that she had taken from a relative who worked at a Knoxville hospital, but county library data revealed no proof of such borrowing rights. Every month during the summer and fall of 1953, Cordelia went alone to Dr. Peaton's office to ask for modifications to Magnolia's prescription schedule. She claimed that Magnolia's health was progressively declining and that she was no longer able to cook, clothe herself, or have simple conversations without getting upset. Dr. Peaton's notes reveal rising worry about treating a patient. He was unable to examine personally. But Cordelia's evident devotion to her sister's care and the practical constraints of visiting their isolated location persuaded him to continue giving sedatives and anxiety drugs based on her accounts. Barbiturates and early tranquilizers, which were then widely used to treat anxiety and what were then known as nervous illnesses, were part of the drug regimen that Dr. Peaton prescribed. Nevertheless, examination of historical pharmacy data shows that Cordelia was acquiring much greater amounts of these drugs than would have been suitable for a single patient, even one who was in extreme mental suffering. When questioned about the inconsistencies, she explained that Magnolia frequently spilled or lost her medications owing to her disoriented state, necessitating larger prescriptions to ensure appropriate therapy. Mrs. Carmichael, the nearest neighbor, eventually presented testimony that disputed several of Cordelia's allegations concerning Magnolia's condition. According to her, she saw Magnolia working in the garden in the summer of 1954, looking attentive and capable of handling challenging duties, according to a 1959 statement she gave to county officials. On one occasion, she had a brief talk with Magnolia while both women were harvesting wild blackberries near the property border. During their chat, Mrs. Carmichael saw that Magnolia appeared nervous and constantly glanced back toward the farmhouse, but she also described Magnolia as quiet but very sensible. More disturbing was Mrs. Carmichael's observation of lights in the Tinsley farmhouse during the late nighttime hours. From her own land, she could see the distant glimmer of kerosene lanterns moving through the home long past midnight on multiple occasions. When she brought this up to Cordelia during a fortuitous meeting at the general shop, Cordelia clarified that Magnolia's illness resulted in extreme sleeplessness and that she frequently spent the night wandering the home in a disoriented state, necessitating continuous oversight. The cycle continued through 1954 and into 1955, with Cordelia making her regular visits to Dr. Peaton while insisting that Magnolia's health prevented any direct medical inspection. Although none were formally examined at the time, a number of alarming instances were reported to county officials during this time. In the spring of 1955, a traveling salesman claimed to have knocked on the door of the Tinsley farmhouse and heard what sounded like a woman pleading for assistance from someplace inside the house. When Cordelia answered the door, she explained that her sister was undergoing one of her episodes and apologized for any inconvenience. The salesman observed that Cordelia appeared very anxious during their brief encounter and blocked his view of the house. Similarly, the postal carrier, Eugene Hartwell, stated that mail delivery to the Tinsley property had grown increasingly unusual. Cordelia had requested that all mail be put in a box at the end of the long driveway rather than taken to the house, saying that unexpected guests upset her sister's condition. Mr. Hartwell stated that he never saw Magnolia during his delivery after the spring of 1954. When he inquired about her sister's condition, Cordelia gave him more detailed explanations regarding Magnolia's declining mental state and her need for total seclusion from outside stimulus, even though he had previously interacted with both sisters on a regular basis. The situation reached a critical point in November of 1955 when Dr. Pimpton got an urgent call from Cordelia asking for help right away. She reported that Magnolia had experienced what seemed to be a catastrophic psychiatric break and was in need of care. However, when Dr. Peaton arrived at the farm with arrangements for emergency transfer to the state hospital in Nashville, Cordelia welcomed him at the door and explained that the crisis had passed. She stated that Magnolia had experienced a brief period of consciousness and was now resting quietly, although remained too brittle to be examined or transported. Dr. Peaton's notes from this visit reflect his growing mistrust regarding the scenario. He saw that the farmhouse appeared to be in a condition of remarkable order, with no sign of the violent occurrence Cordelia had recounted. Cordelia stated that her sister was extremely sedated and that any disruption could set off another episode when he asked to see Magnolia, even if it was only from a distance. Dr. Peaton did, however, see hearing movement and what sounded like. Cordelia insisted that Magnolia was comatose due to medication, yet there were muffled noises coming from the upper story of the house. Dr. A. Peaton started recording his concerns in a more methodical manner after this consultation. He pointed out inconsistencies in Cordelia's explanations of her sister's symptoms, especially her propensity to give conflicting details regarding the onset and intensity of several episodes. Additionally, he started to feel uneasy about how much medicine he was prescribing based only on second-hand reports. His records indicate that he began to believe that Magnolia's condition might be the product of over-medication rather than an underlying psychological illness. An unexpected source provided the breakthrough in comprehending what was truly happening at the Tinsley farm. In February of 1956, a surveyor working on behalf of the county to update property borders was doing measurements near the Tinsley property when he spotted something that would later be vital to solving: the reality. While working in the woods adjacent to the farm, he observed a woman hanging washing behind the house. The woman seemed to be moving regularly and effectively, which caught his attention. Complete the activity without any trace of the crippling disease that Cordelia had mentioned to Dr. Peaton and others. Marcus Whitfield, the surveyor, subsequently stated in his testimony that he observed this behavior for a number of minutes while hiding in the treine. He saw the woman, whom he guessed to be Magnolia based on her, cleaning, hanging laundry, feeding hens, and performing other ordinary home activities with complete expertise. More importantly, he observed that she seemed to be looking around anxiously, as though she was worried about being watched. The woman dropped what she was doing and rushed through the back entrance of the house as soon as a door crashed at the front. Whitfield returned to the area on later days while conducting his survey work as a result of his observation. Over the course of a week, Steve noted multiple occasions of observing Magnolia working outside the house at periods when Cordelia was known to be away from the property. In contrast to the picture of serious psychiatric incapacity that Cordelia had been giving to medical authorities, his records, which were ultimately given to county authorities, portrayed Magnolia as appearing physically well and cognitively attentive throughout these observations. These insights have unsettling ramifications, if Magnolia was capable of normal function while her sister wasn't around, implying that Cordelia's presence had some bearing on her stated condition. The substantial amounts of medicine that Cordelia had been acquiring on her sister's behalf were also called into question by Whitfield's evidence. These observations raised the likelihood that Magnolia was being drugged on a regular basis to keep her in a confused and dependent state. When county representatives tried to look into these issues in the spring, they faced major challenges in 1956. Cordelia refused to allow any formal inspection of the property or any contact with Magnolia, citing her sister's fragile mental health and the danger for provoking a catastrophic psychological episode. She presented medical papers from Dr. Peaton supporting the requirement for full isolation and minimum stimulation, county officials lacking particular evidence of wrongdoing and bound by the limited legal frameworks of the period for probing family. Circumstances were unable to investigate the issue further. However, Dr. Peaton, increasingly unhappy with the situation, made the decision to suspend providing medication for Magnolia without a direct examination. In June 1956, Cordelia came to his office to renew her sister's medicines, and he told her that he had to see his patient firsthand before continuing therapy due to medical ethics. This requirement caused Cordelia to respond in a very negative way. According to Dr. Peaton's notes, she grew irate and accusing, saying that her sister would die from psychological anguish as a result of his failure to keep taking medication. The altercation in Dr. Peaton's office revealed facets of Cordelia's personality that had been veiled beneath her veneer of devoted caregiver. Later, witnesses in the waiting area reported hearing heated voices and what appeared to be threats. Mrs. Dorothy Fletcher, Dr. Peaton's receptionist, stated in court that Cordelia claimed the physician had abandoned his obligations and threatened to denounce him to medical authorities for irresponsible care. Her response seems out of proportion to the legitimate request for a direct patient assessment. Following this occurrence, Cordelia presumably sought medical attention for Magnolia from sources outside the county. According to pharmacy records, she started getting prescriptions from a doctor in Cookville, which is almost 60 miles distant, on the grounds that her sister's condition needed specialized care. Not accessible locally. The frequency of these travels and the continuing buying of significant supplies of sedative drugs generated additional concerns among local people who watched Cordelia's comings and goings. Several locals reported seeing changes in the Tinsley property between the middle of 1956 and the beginning of 1957, which suggested something important was going on. Mrs. Carmichael observed that the garden, which had been kept up during Magnolia's alleged earlier years, illness slipped into neglect. There was no new planting, and the carefully maintained vegetables from the summer of 1956 were left to rot in the fields. The next spring. Furthermore, it seemed that the farm building's general upkeep was fast declining, with equipment being allowed to decay in the elements and repairs being disregarded. Even more concerning, neighbors reported that they could no longer find any indications of Magnolia's presence on the land. The repeated sightings of the movement in the garden and the hanging of washing, which had been intermittent until 1956, completely stopped. Cordelia gave increasingly detailed and intricate medical explanations when asked directly about her sister's condition. She told about Magnolia having experienced a full psychiatric collapse and required round-the-clock care that precluded any outdoor exercise or exposure to external stimulus. The postal carrier, Eugene Hartwell, reported several developments during this period. Mail delivery, which had been consistent throughout the years, started to fluctuate and occasionally went weeks without being picked up. When he visited Cordelia, she appeared increasingly unkempt and spoke with what he described as nervous passion about her sister's declining condition and the terrible responsibility of providing continual care. She recalled having to deliver drugs at specific intervals throughout the day and night, and spoke of her own tiredness following months of sleep deprivation in the autumn. Of 1957, a traveling preacher named Reverend Samuel Ashford paid an unannounced visit to the Tinsley farm as part of his circuit through rural areas. His later report to local religious officials produced one of the most frightening first-hand accounts of the situation at the farm. Reverend Ashford's written evidence states that Cordelia first denied him access to the house, saying that her sister's illness precluded any guests. However, his insistence in delivering spiritual comfort eventually prompted her to permit a brief visit. According to Reverend Ashford, the house's inside was unusually organized, and one of the bedrooms seemed to have a medical setup. He noted the presence of various bottles of medication, feeding equipment, and restraints that Cordelia stated were necessary for managing her sister's violent bouts. Cordelia brought him to a dimly lit room where he saw a woman lying when he asked to pray with Magnolia. In bed, seemingly comatose or under a strong sedative. The woman in the bed appeared to be physically restrained, with what appeared to be leather bands fastening her wrists to the bed frame. This was what most deeply unsettled Reverend Ashford. When he questioned this, Cordelia stated that her sister's psychological condition caused her to damage herself during moments of bewilderment, and that the shackles were necessary for her own protection. However, Reverend Ashford highlighted that the restraints appeared to be permanent features rather than transitory protective measures. Reverend Ashford also noted that the woman in the bed seemed to be in bad physical condition while appearing unconscious. She looked to have lost a lot of weight since his last visit to the farm a few years prior, and her skin had an unhealthy pallor. Cordelia clarified that her sister's psychological state was the reason behind her refusal to eat when he voiced concerns about her physical health, and that woodland feeding was occasionally necessary to prevent famine. Following his visit to the Tinsley farm, Reverend Ashford contacted county officials to voice his worries about what he had observed. His original complaint, made in October of 1957, revealed what he considered to be the systematic mistreatment and confinement of Magnolia Tinsley by her sister. However, the investigation that followed met the same difficulties that had thwarted prior inquiries. Cordelia refused to authorize any official examination of Magnolia or property inspection, and county officials were not legally permitted to compel entrance based only on the issues brought up. The situation persisted in this worrying stalemate through the winter of 1957 and into 1958. County records suggest that numerous agencies sought to examine the situation at the Tinsley farm, but each probe was hindered by Cordelia's refusal to participate and the absence of direct evidence of criminal conduct. The legislative structure for safeguarding. During this time, family autonomy was highly respected, even in situations where abuse was suspected and vulnerable adults were primitive. The settlement of the case came through circumstances that no one could have foreseen. A powerful storm system passed across eastern Tennessee in March 1958, bringing with it tornadoes that left the area severely damaged. One of these tornadoes struck the Tinsley farm directly, destroying the barn and seriously damaging the home. Responders to emergencies. When they arrived to evaluate storm damage, they made findings that would ultimately expose the reality of what had been going on at the remote farm. Cordelia was in great panic when volunteer firefighters and emergency personnel arrived at the Tinsley farm. She said that her sister had been hurt in the storm and needed emergency medical assistance. But even these seasoned emergency personnel were taken aback by Magnolia's state when they reached the wrecked property. She was discovered in the bedroom upstairs that Reverend Ashford had seen, very malnourished and dehydrated, and forcibly restrained. The results of the subsequent medical examination showed how much Magnolia had been harmed over the years. Dr. Robert Hensley, who was rushed in to give emergency treatment, noted signs of prolonged physical restraint, systematic overmedication, and deliberate food deprivation. His medical report filed with county officials defined Magnolia's condition as in line with abuse and extended incarceration. Blood testing indicated deadly levels of barbiturates and other sedative medications in her system, far above any therapeutic dosage. More alarming was the evidence that Magnolia's mental state had been purposefully altered through the systematic injection of medicines that had created cognitive impairment and psychological dependency. According to Dr. Hensley's examination, her alleged mental disorder had been created and sustained by, deliberately, isolation and restricted medicine. She had been physically confined for lengthy periods of time, as evidenced by the signs of long-term use of the restraints discovered in her chamber. Magnolia's actual condition became clear after she was admitted to the hospital and progressively weaned off of the drugs that had been regulating her mental state. She was able to testify about her treatment even though years of abuse had impaired her cognitive abilities. Her description of farm life showed a methodical campaign of psychological, and physical control that had began immediately after their father's death in 1953. According to Magnolia's testimony, given in multiple sessions as her physical and mental condition improved, Cordelia had begun providing pharmaceuticals to her soon after they inherited the farm, stating that the medications were necessary to manage anxiety caused to their father's death. But over time, the dosages had been progressively raised, and what had started off as a purported cure had become into a way to maintain total authority over her thoughts and actions. Magnolia recalled being told that she was suffering from a severe mental disorder that required daily medication and isolation from outside stimulation. Cordelia had convinced her that any attempt to leave the house or contact outsiders would result in a full psychiatric breakdown that could prove fatal. The physical constraints had been added gradually, described as vital protection against self-injury during claimed moments of violence. That Magnolia could not remember owing to the impact of the medicines. Just as intricate as the physical abuse had been the psychological manipulation. Magnolia's sense of reality and independence had been gradually eroded by Cordelia, who persuaded her that she was completely reliant on her sister's care and incapable of performing even the most basic tasks. Any moments of insight or attempts to resist were seen as indicators of mental illness requiring additional medicine and harsher control. The rationale for Cordelia's actions remained largely hidden, but inquiry into the family's financial position revealed key aspects. As the elder daughter, Cordelia had inherited possession of the farm and its riches, but only under the condition that she care for her younger sister. According to court records, Cordelia would acquire permanent possession of the whole estate if Magnolia were found incapable of caring for herself or deemed incompetent. Additionally, Magnolia had been receiving disability payments from the government based on payments that Cordelia had been collecting and managing, as well as information about her mental state. The rural town was rocked by the revelation of Cordelia's persistent abuse of her sister, which also prompted unsettling questions about how such a scenario could have continued unchecked for almost 5 years. The case demonstrated how vulnerable isolated people are to abuse by family members and how inadequate social and medical agencies are at safeguarding victims who are kept secret. Outside contact. After being detained, Cordelia was accused of several offenses, including fraud, assault, confinement, and abuse of a vulnerable adult. But the court case demonstrated how difficult it was to prosecute similar cases in the 1950s. The rights of people like Magnolia were not adequately safeguarded by outdated mental health legislation. Additionally, Cordelia's defense team stated that her conduct had been driven by genuine concern for her sister's welfare and that she had been following medical instructions in providing medication and care. The trial, which began in November of 1958, garnered great attention from both local media and legal observers interested in the burgeoning field of family abuse prosecution. The intricacy of Cordelia's control and manipulation, as well as the methodical manner in which she had misled community members and medical experts about her sister's condition, were made clear by the testimony. Dr. Peyton talked about his mounting misgivings and his ultimate decision to discontinue medication, while neighbors supplied reports of their observations and the excuses Cordelia had given for her sister's isolation. Magnolia's testimony, which she gave after months of recuperation and rehabilitation, was arguably the most persuasive. She talked about the psychological manipulation that had persuaded her of her own powerlessness and mental inadequacy, in addition to the physical violence she had experienced. Her story demonstrated Cordelia's methodical management and how she had exploited familial relationships and medical authority to perpetuate her power. Cordelia was sentenced to 15 years in the state penitentiary after the jury found her guilty on several counts. However, the judicial resolution brought only partial justice for the years of cruelty Magnolia had undergone. The psychological harm from chronic drug-induced bewilderment and systematic manipulation required significant rehabilitation, and many of the effects proved to be permanent. Magnolia's recuperation was slow and incomplete. Though she restored much of her cognitive ability after withdrawal from the medicines that had been managing her mental state, the years of psychological torture had left permanent repercussions. To regain her independence and get past the learned helplessness that Cordelia's manipulation had ingrained in her, she needed intensive therapy. She will experience persistent health issues for the rest of her life as a result of the physical impacts of extended constraint and starvation. The farm in Tinsley was sold to pay for Magnolia's medical care and rehabilitation, and she moved to live with distant relatives in a neighboring county. She maintained a low profile for the remainder of her life, rarely addressing her experiences and avoiding any public attention relating to the case. Those who knew her during her rehabilitation characterized her as brilliant and capable, but distinguished by a chronic fatigue that mirrored the horror of her years under Cordelia's control. The case had larger consequences for how similar circumstances were identified and dealt with. Instead of depending just on family stories, medical experts started creating procedures for directly examining patients to confirm their diseases. Legal structures for protecting vulnerable adults were reinforced, while progress was modest and numerous gaps lingered for decades. Perhaps most critically, the Tinsley case revealed how predatory family members might exploit medical authority and social seclusion to maintain control over victims. The advanced character of Cordelia's manipulation, such as her use of medical jargon and methodical deceit of medical professionals, exposed hitherto unidentified or poorly understood types of abuse. The Tinsley Farm's disclosures led to a number of similar inquiries, according to county documents from the time after the case. Medical professionals and social workers started to examine isolated patients receiving family care more closely, especially when direct patient contact was involved, was limited or avoided. However, there were still few resources and legal mechanisms available for intervention, and it's possible that more long-term familial abuse cases went unreported. Before being granted parole in 1969, Cordelia completed 11 of her 15-year term. Prison records indicate that she maintained her innocence throughout her incarceration, claiming that her acts had been driven by real medical worries for her sister's welfare. She repeatedly denied any deliberate abuse or deception, instead presenting herself as a kind caregiver who had been overburdened by her sister's intricate mental health requirements. After being freed, Cordelia moved to a distant part of Tennessee and took on a new identity. Her movements and occupation are documented by parole records until the middle of the 1970s, when supervision ceased and her later life was left unrecorded. Those who encountered her during the parole period characterized her as intelligent and articulate, but noted an underlying energy that made them uneasy in her presence. The psychiatric test completed during Cordelia's imprisonment indicated a complicated personality typified by narcissistic tendencies and an apparent inability to acknowledge the rights and autonomy of others, particularly family members. Prison psychologists observed that she had a propensity to justify her domineering actions as essential care, and that she was adept at disguising her manipulative objectives while projecting an air of reason and compassion. More disturbing was according to the examination, Cordelia's actions were not an impulsive reaction to the situation, but rather a planned campaign of control. Her acts were especially troubling because they were planned and premeditated, as evidenced by the methodical way she drugged and restrained Magnolia, and by the clever way she deceived medical professionals and community people. In Tennessee and other states, the Tinsley case's legacy impacted social work practices, judicial procedures, and medical practice. School curricula started to include instruction on family manipulation and the value of direct patient access. Stronger safeguards for vulnerable persons and more transparent protocols for intervention in suspected abuse instances were promoted by legal experts. The example did, however, also illustrate the continued susceptibility of isolated people to family predators who may take advantage of medical systems and societal presumptions around family care. The respect for family autonomy that had safeguarded Cordelia's abuse of her sister remained a major force in American society, providing enduring obstacles for recognizing and managing comparable circumstances. Magnolia Tinsley lived until 1989, dying at the age of 62 from issues related to diabetes and heart disease that may have been tied to the long-term effects of her abuse. Those who knew her during her latter years characterized her as having found a measure of serenity, but never totally escaping the psychic shadow of her experience at the farm. She never married or had children, and she maintained minimal communication with extended family members who had failed to recognize or handle her predicament during the years of her incarceration. Legal experts and abuse researchers became reinterested in the case after her death because they saw the Tinsley case as an early illustration of what would eventually be recognized as a complicated form of domestic abuse involving psychological control and medical manipulation. The example was included in the literature that social workers and medical professionals used to learn about the warning signals and dynamics of systematic family abuse. The farmhouse where the abuse occurred remained uninhabited for several years after the trial, becoming a subject of local mythology and occasional vandalism. Developers eventually bought it, tore down the building, and divided the land for residential construction in the country. No sign or memorial shows what transpired at the location, and most present residents of the region are unaware of its past. Almost 10 years after the trial, in 1967, Patricia, a graduate student, Williamson found the Tinsley case materials in county archives while doing research on rural Tennessee genealogy. The sophistication of Cordelia's maltreatment and its consequences for comprehending family dynamics and medical manipulation were once again brought to light by her study of the material and subsequent scholarly paper. Williamson's study found fresh details about the case that had not emerged during the original trial. Her analysis of financial records shows that Cordelia, during Magnolia's years in captivity, she had methodically drained the joint family's assets, transferring savings and property into personal accounts that she alone could access. The economic reason for maintaining control over her sister had been considerably larger than previously assumed. Additionally, Williamson's interviews with surviving community members revealed that some people had harbored suspicions about the situation at the Tinsley farm, but had felt helpless to act on their concerns due to social standards respecting family privacy and the lack of convincing evidence. The conspiracy of silence that had sheltered Cordelia's abuse reflected broader social attitudes that favored family autonomy over individual protection. Additionally, the study revealed indications that Cordelia may have experimented with different medications and dosages on her sister, using Magnolia as a test subject to examine the effects of different drug combinations. Following the tornado, medicine bottles were discovered in the farmhouse. Included drug remnants that none of the doctors Cordelia had seen had recommended, indicating that she had taken pills from several sources and given them without a doctor's supervision. This admission presented the frightening possibility that Cordelia's maltreatment of her sister had involved elements of premeditated experimentation with mind-altering chemicals. The methodical manner of her record-keeping, uncovered among her personal papers, revealed that she had been following the impact of Magnolia's behavior and mental state with clinical detachment under various medication regimes. These findings had ramifications that went beyond the particular instance to more general concerns of patient safety and medical ethics. The ease with which Cordelia had been able to get huge quantities of prohibited medications based simply on her reports of her sister's condition highlighted substantial gaps in the medical system's safeguards against abuse. Professional medical organizations utilized the Tinsley case as an example in building new guidelines for patient evaluation and drug management. Stricter enforcement of the need for direct physician-patient contact prior to the prescription of controlled medications was implemented, and doctors received training on how to spot possible pharmaceutical abuse by family caregivers. In the 1960s and 1970s, the case also had an impact on the creation of adult protective services programs in Tennessee and other states. Social professionals received instruction, specifically focused on spotting symptoms of family abuse and the legal ability to investigate suspected crimes, even when family members attempted to limit access to prospective victims. However, the underlying issues that had enabled Cordelia's maltreatment of her sister persisted in various forms. Family predators continued to find refuge in rural remoteness, and intervention in suspected abuse situations was still hampered by the respect for family autonomy. The development of legal structures to safeguard vulnerable adults was gradual, disparately amongst various jurisdictions. The Tinsley case became a reference point for understanding how intelligent and articulate abusers might exploit medical institutions and societal attitudes to maintain power over their victims. The sophistication that family abuse could attain when perpetrators knew how to take advantage of social and medical systems was demonstrated by Cordelia's ability to pose as a loving caregiver while methodically destroying her sister's autonomy and health. Instruction. Programs for health care providers, social workers, and law enforcement personnel began incorporating lessons from the Tinsley case about the importance of maintaining skepticism about family reports of patient conditions and the need for independent verification of medical needs and treatment compliance. The case demonstrated how predators might manipulate and control victims by using genuine medical terminology and processes. The psychological dynamics shown in the Tinsley case also influenced the development of trauma. Therapeutic methods for long-term family abuse victims. Magnolia's experience of learned helplessness and reality distortion formed part of the literature used to explain how victims could be methodically convinced of their own inadequacy and dependent through manipulation of their physiological and psychological status. Research into the long-term effects of systematic drugging and psychological manipulation expanded largely in response to problems presented by the Tinsley case. The revelation that sophisticated abuse could be sustained for years without being discovered by medical professionals prompted research into the potential for recovery following prolonged periods of control, as well as the cognitive and emotional harm caused by such treatment. The case also contributed to broader concerns regarding the nature of family connections and the potential for exploitation within apparently loving dynamics. Cordelia's capacity to uphold the appearance of loving sisterly care while methodically undermining Magnolia's independence demonstrated how family bonds could be used as a weapon against weaker people. Legal scholars studying the case noted how Cordelia had exploited not only medical systems, but also social expectations about family loyalty and privacy. Her ability to prevent outside intervention by claiming to protect her sister's medical privacy demonstrated how legitimate concerns about confidentiality could be manipulated to shield abuse from detection. The Tinsley case remained relevant to professionals working with vulnerable adults well into the modern era, as detection and intervention systems continued to face difficulties due to the basic dynamics of medical abuse and family manipulation. Training materials developed decades after the original case continued to reference the sophisticated nature of Cordelia's manipulation as an example of how family predators could exploit institutional systems. Most importantly, the case served as a reminder that apparent concern for a victim's welfare, intelligence, and eloquence could conceal systemic abuse and exploitation. the necessity for systemic safeguards that went beyond relying on first impressions or family representations was highlighted by Cordelia's capacity to mislead medical professionals, community members, and even some investigators. Years of abuse had been made possible in large part by the Tinsley farm's isolation. However, the case also demonstrated how communities with potential helpers could artificially maintain isolation. Cordelia's systematic prevention of her sister's interactions with outsiders showed how predators could erect physical and psychological barriers that effectively isolated victims even when they weren't far away. Magnolia's gradual subjugation, which started with ostensibly therapeutic medication and progressed to total physical and psychological control, demonstrated how abuse could worsen over time in ways that made intervention more challenging. The initial phases of Cordelia's deception had appeared to be legitimate medical care, making it difficult for observers to identify when treatment had become abuse. The financial motivation underlying Cordelia's actions added another layer of complexity to the case, demonstrating how economic incentives could drive family members to maintain control over vulnerable relatives through medical manipulation. The combination of inheritance issues and disability payments had created powerful incentives for Cordelia to prevent her sister from achieving independence or recuperation. In the end, the Tinsley case became a turning point in our understanding of family abuse, not because it was the most extreme instance of such treatment, but rather because it exposed the sophisticated strategies that cunning predators could employ to keep control over their victims while eluding detection by social and medical systems. The case illustrated how abuse could be hidden in plain sight through manipulation of legitimate institutions and social expectations. Years after the original events, the questions raised by the Tinsley case continued to challenge professionals working to protect vulnerable adults. How could patient conditions be verified by medical systems without infringing on valid privacy concerns? How could social services intervene in suspected abuse cases while respecting family autonomy? How could communities identify sophisticated manipulation that masqueraded as caring family relationships? The answers developed in response to these questions evolved over decades. However, the underlying conflicts between privacy and intervention, autonomy and protection, remained pertinent to contemporary practice. The Tinsley case served as a reminder that protecting vulnerable individuals required not only good intentions, but also systematic safeguards against manipulation and sophisticated understanding of how abuse could exploit legitimate systems and relationships. Ultimately,